I will just jump in at the deep end and begin, by with this book that I read some time ago. And, but I'll come back to this book. So we are the inheritors of gifts from the past. And if we consider the huge legacy that our ancestors have left us, those who were in Mesopotamia 10,000 years ago, who cleared the land, built the waterways, founded the cities where we now live, who made the scientific discoveries, won the political struggles, and created the great works of art, all those people who went before us. And we very seldom stop to think about how they have transformed our lives. Most of their names have been forgotten by history. But among those who are remembered is this person, Jonas Salk, the medical researcher. So, what did he do? In 1955, after nearly a decade of painstaking experiments, Salk and his team developed the first successful and safe polio vaccine. Okay. Now, for its times, it was an extraordinary breakthrough because polio paralyzed or killed at least 500,000 people worldwide each year. So he was immediately hailed as a miracle worker, but he was not interested in fame and fortune. He never sought to have the vaccine patented. All he wanted to do was to be of, as he said, some help to humankind and leave a positive legacy for future generations. So in later, after several years, he expressed his philosophy of life in a single question. He said, are we being good ancestors? And he believed that just as we have inherited so many riches from the past, we must also pass them on to our descendants. And he was convinced that in order to do so and to confront global crises such as humanity's destruction of the natural world and the threat of nuclear war, we needed a radical shift in our perspective towards one that was focused on long term thinking and the consequences of our actions beyond our own lifetimes. So instead of thinking on a scale of seconds, minutes, days, and months, we should extend our time horizon to encompass a much longer span, decades, centuries, or probably millennia. And only then would we be truly respecting and honoring of the generations to come. Now, uh, in this book, the author talks about how this question may turn out to be his greatest contribution to history, and rendered in a more active form. How can one be? How can we be good ancestors? Is considered to be the most important question of our time. So, with that, we move to the anthropologist Mary Catherine Bateson, who talks about the great irony of our time. And she says the great irony of our time is that even as we are living longer, we are thinking shorter. This is the age of the tyranny of the now. And we know we live in a world of social media and of instant gratification in terms of social media. And we see multiple instances of harmful short termism, right? Governments who prefer quick fix solutions, such as continuing to subsidize mining and the coal industry instead of transiting to renewable energy and so on. There are a billion examples. Now, just as serious is the possibility of civilizational breakdown due to our relentless destruction of the ecological systems on which not only our well being, but life itself depends. As we keep thoughtlessly pumping out fossil fuels, poisoning our oceans, and destroying species at a rate that amounts to a sixth extinction, as they say. The great coral reef is already damaged beyond repair, right? So the prospect of devastating impacts gets even much closer. And in our hyper networked age, this threat now exists on a worldwide scale. We have no planet B that we can run to. Yeah. And according to the environmental historian uh, Jared Diamond, such sociological destruction has been at the root of civilizational collapse throughout human history. Its major underlying cause, he argues, is an overdose of thinking that is only based on the now. And in the absence of courageous long-term thinking. So we have been warned. And who exactly will bear the consequences of our temporal myopia? It is not just our children and grandchildren but those who will be born in the centuries ahead or millennia later, if at all the human race survives. And the moment has come now for wealthy nations to recognize a disturbing truth that we have colonized the future. Hmm? And we think that the future is somewhere in the distance, some kind of a colonial outpost devoid of people, where we can freely dump the ecological degradation, technological risk, and nuclear waste of our time, and that we can plunder as we please. Now, when Britain colonized Australia in the 18th and 19th centuries, it drew on a legal doctrine, which is now known as terra nullius, which means nobody's land, to justify its conquest and treat the indigenous population as if they didn't exist or as if they didn't have any claims on the land. And today, our social attitude is one of tempus nullius. The future is seen as nobody's time, an unclaimed territory that is similarly devoid of people. And this is ours for the taking. Just as indigenous Australians still struggle against the legacy of terra nullius, so too there is a struggle to be had against the doctrine of tempus nullius, or nobody's time. So the tragedy is that the future generations can do nothing about this today, even as we are pillaging their futures. They can't throw themselves in front of the king's horse like a suffragette. They cannot block an Alabama bridge like a civil rights activist, or go on a salt march like Gandhi to defy the colonial oppressors. So, anyway, there's no political rights or representation in this ecological territory. So, we are all in a tug of war for time. These images are from uh, the museum in your own city, which is a wonderful, wonderful museum. I was completely lost in it for hours when I visited Melbourne. So we can only learn from those with a longer vision. And the indigenous or aboriginal people, in not only in Australia but across the globe, do something that is called a 7-generation decision making, which encompasses a time span of nearly 2 centuries. But of course, there is a foundation in California called the Long Now Foundation that is even more ambitious. It has set the time horizon at 10,000 years on the grounds that the first human civilizations emerged 10 millennia ago at the end of the last ice age. And so we should develop an equal perspective into the future. So we need to be imaginative with our temporal imaginations, and adventurous with our temporal imaginations. And at the very least, when we aim to think long term, we need to take a deep breath and think 100 years or more, which is often called the acorn brain. You plant a seed of an acorn today, and you do not know when you are not likely to reap the fruits of it, right? So so instead of posting our selfies on Instagram, can we plant that acorn in the ground today? So this is long-term thinking. And over the last century, anthropologists have studied wayfinding, for example, among indigenous people, from the stick maps of the canoeists in the Marshall Islands that depict tidal movements, which are complex or dangerous reefs, to the song lines or the dreaming tracks of the Aboriginal people in Australia that enable them, the anthropologists, to literally sing a trail of landmarks that appear over vast territory. And we are the inheritors of such traditions, which have bequeathed us the cognitive talents to not just plan our journeys across the landscape, but also through the timescapes of the future. So, with that, we come to culture. What is culture? It is something that is continuously transmitted, you'll agree. And this process has traditionally been viewed as having two elements: one, material; two, non material. Um, By the material aspects of culture, we mean things that we can see around us, tools, ceramics, furniture, buttons, and so on. And the non-material includes इनको बोलो ना चले जाए please. Folklore, mores, values, traditions, and other such intangible aspects of culture. And then what is material culture? So material culture is the physical evidence of human experience. It is culture made material. And beginning necessarily with things, but not ending with them, the study of material cultures urges us to use objects to approach human thoughts and action. And these objects vary in cultures separated by geography, time, and belief systems. The material culture of the Aboriginal and the Torres Strait Islander people of Australia will vary widely, as we all know, from the Alaskan Eskimos or Aboriginal communities in India, of which we have many. A 19th century farmer in Tasmania from the 20th century farmer in Tasmania will have vastly different material cultures. And even people who share the same time and environment, such as the first Prussian settlers in South Australia and the Swan River colony, which later came to be known as West Australia in the 19th century, will again have their own material culture. So this is an object I wish to introduce you to. Chetan will know this, of course. We call this the kulhad. It is made of clay, of terracotta, and traditionally, this is what we had our tea in, chai, as we call it. So, what is so special about this kulhad? Now, if you consider the sweep of the form itself, it is a thing of clay, it is dug from the earth, and it is still very gritty. The sweeps of its maker's fingers run in this slow spiral of its raising as it is raised from the potter's wheel. And in that moment of dampness, when this kulhad stood in some pliable uncertainty, and the rim kind of wobbled, that's what the kulhad is about. So it probably remembers its time in the fire when it became firm, or the glaze that melted in the flame that was molten, blistered, and flowing. Now, this kulhad is filled with hot tea. I have a cup in my hand, not the kulhad, of course, right now. And you cup it in your palm, you hold it like this, and it warms your palms and gives you an instant of transitory experience. So, in this form, the maker's desire for beauty is materialized. It is also a tool to forge social affinity. We forge social bonds over cups of tea. And material, which is a part of the world, a record of our bodily action in nature, continually displays the process of its design, the pattern in the mind of its creator. Now, the history of most people is preserved in unwritten artifacts such as this. So, the meaning of the object arises in the interface between the object and the person. Now, in the study of material culture, we use this term, artifact. What does this term do? It evokes the artisan's act made by hand, the conversion of the natural into the artificial, and it associates all things with creation. Today, of course, we have another word called goods, which is more in terms of capitalist consumption, where things are commodities and possessions, and it is all industrial production. So all things are artifacts. They are also goods, and material culture study needs both orientation. Now, the students of artifacts engage them as creations, as blendings of nature and will, of design, of slight use and commerce. And we typically tend to avoid the moral issues which are necessarily inherent in the contemplation of economic systems. So the students of, if you are a student of goods and not artifacts, you will encounter things as commercial ciphers, slighting creators and avoiding the moral issues raised through consideration of systems and production. Now, anyway, all this mumbo jumbo apart, basically what we mean is that material culture can enable us to know a great deal about human behavior, creativity, and the impact of the economic, environmental, and technological forces on humankind, among other things. Various kinds of people, as you see on the slide, are involved in its study. And through their combined efforts, research can illuminate to us the complicated interactions between people and things. So, what are the sort of questions and what are the kinds of answers that this seeks? It tries to understand why things were made, why they took the forms that they did, what social, functional, and artistic needs they served, and so on. And if we study material culture, it can also offer insights into the lives of people who have left little or no records. So basically, even historians depend on the work of archaeologists and anthropologists in order to reconstruct the patterns of life in the past. So, one tangible aspect or manifestation of material culture is traditional crafts that are significant both in India and Australia. And the term craft, used in a specific sense, means those activities that deal with the conversion of specific materials into products using primarily hand skills, simple tools, and which deploy local wisdom of craft processes that have been passed down over generations. Yeah. And in India, we call them artisans, but we also call them craftspeople. So throughout India, a staggering range of craft traditions have held sway for thousands of years, from the rough hewn functional objects of daily use, such as the kullad that I showed you earlier, which use local materials, simple technical processes, to very complex sacred votive objects of worship, or which exhibit a high degree of craftsmanship and technical excellence with symbolic value. Yeah. And basically, the crafts are imbued with social, economic, cultural, religious, ecological influences. And in India, it's a vast sector with many intertwining strands of tradition, heritage, values, culture, generations, and so on. A rich repository of forms, motifs, and craftsmanship. So, textures, colors, techniques, all of this, is in play here. And each of these have evolved over a long period of time to attain particular regional characteristics that have very distinctive styles of their own. In fact, when NID was to be formed, NID was, of course, set up in 1961. But in the late 1950s, when the American designer duo of Charles and Rains were invited by the government of India just after independence to, to suggest a blueprint for a design institute, they recognized in what is called the India Report uh, this socio-cultural embedding of the crafts in India, and which served as the lodestone for NID. So just to give you an idea, this is a sector in India of over 20 million practitioners with a geographical spread across the country, which covers vastly different work structures, work cultures, sociological cultures, and employing different techniques and technologies using materials from clay to precious metal. So it's the second largest employment sector in India, provides employment today, I think, to 30 million people. And over 60% of our population in India actually live in villages. So uh, crafts also share more than 20% of the Indian population. One in every 200 Indians is an artisan. So, what do we see in crafts? We see a wonderful coagulation of all these things in the first bullet. They are about the making of the imagination, the rendering of it, the expressions of it. You cast something, there is an image, there's a relationship between the artisan and his work. And there is very importantly, a relationship to the world, to the environment, the natural environment around the artisan. the ecological system that is pervasive in that area. And each of these has three aspects actually, So one, there is a political economy, which means nodes and networks, technology, instrumentation, economic and political regime. Crafts also have to do with knowledge and metaphysics, so design, structure, and form. And three, social relations. So, what are these work cultures and divisions of labor that are inherent in a particular craft tradition? So, in the physical dimension, these three aspects they become the workspace. Hmm? And there is a convergence of plural time work cycles. Many of the crafts are based on the seasons. So there is a certain sense of time, of cyclical time, that is different from our notion of linear time. And this process is creative and resilient. Therefore, it's a continuing activity. This is very important because then the process becomes the backbone of a society. So, there is also an ecological or environmental aspect of crafts that subsumes all the things I mentioned earlier. The use of indigenous materials, its ecological and climate related aspects, and how a craft can provide a sustainable way of life. So, just take the humble potter as an instance of this. Now, the potter in India is highly respected and is called Prajapati or Vishwakarma, which attributes a kind of godly status to him or her. And the word mati, which means clay in Hindi, basically means both the human and clay. And there is an age old relationship between the two. So, in Gujarat, where I am currently in Western India, there are many sayings that refer to this sacred relationship. So, if a child is born without a limb, for instance, some communities will say that, oh God, they must have lacked that much clay. When a woman is childless, people will say that, oh, people in that region will say, oh, God must have run out of that much clay, and so on and so forth. And many Aboriginal communities in India often offer terracotta figures to appease the gods, a clay leg to heal a leg, a clay hand if their own hand is hurt, an eye for an injured eye, and so on. And so the potter is highly respectful of the clay, the wind, the water, and the sun, the fire, and space, and has to know them well. The entire profession depends on them. A little more or less wind can ruin the pot. He or she cannot go far to look for the material. They have to use what they find nearby. That is the rivers, ponds, mountains, and plains, which have actually wielded a great influence on terracotta. So in India, because different geographical regions have different kinds of clay, in Northeast India, we have a black sticky clay. In somewhere close to where I am in Kutch, the clay is gray and soft. In southern India, it looks like bronze and it has great strength. So this clay is also available in different colors, and this is what is respected by the potter. All artisans and Aboriginal or indigenous people do a kind of thinking that is called bricolage, okay? A way of thinking that is based on observation, on concepts, and this is opposed to scientific or an engineering way of thinking. So basically, we are talking about the distinction between codified and non-codified societies. In non-codified societies, such as those of Aboriginal communities, knowledge is more instinctual, biological, unself-conscious, and relating to senses, or traditionally it has been. And in codified knowledge societies, it's based on text and textual and digital codification, on memory, and so on. So, how are crafts and nature interlinked? And how is it that they respect nature? Because A, there is an awareness of eco-friendly practices. All the images on this slide, for example, are from projects that NID has done in the northeast of India and in Africa. a few countries in Africa. So clay, cane, bamboo, cotton, wood, these are all not only available indigenously, but they are also environmentally friendly. I mean, we know that. And these are the impetus for traditional crafts. So there is a harmonious balance between humankind and nature, between economic growth and environmental aspects, which do not require huge inputs of artificial energy or infrastructure or investment to make them viable. So, but the problem is that today most natural raw materials are being rapidly depleted. Okay, forests are being cut; they're not being replanted. Water is getting polluted. So, in India, we have several examples where certain traditional crafts have died out, gone extinct, or our efforts are being made to revive them because we have pillaged our natural environment. So in a state called Andhra in southern India, cotton fields are being converted to tobacco growing, which means certain textile traditions and the textiles that were typical to the region are gone. Local grasses and reeds are not available in a large in certain regions, and certain crafts are gone. Like this lady weaving the Kilimangalam mat, it's dying. In another place in central India, where there was a perfume making, local perfume making. It's called Ittar. And, this was a craft that thrived there once upon a time, but the water resources have dried up. And so the typical grass that grew in these water bodies is not available anymore. We tend to believe that climate change is a very slow process, but it is worse, it's much worse than we think. And this slowness of climate change is actually a fairy tale. It's as evil or as pernicious as the one that says that it isn't happening at all. We tend to be like ostriches, no? We tend to bury our heads in the ground and believe that nothing is going wrong anywhere. Or we seek solace in comforting delusions that say that, oh, global warming is an Arctic saga. The temperature in the Arctic region is rising at the rate of 3 times that of the rest of the world. And so it will unfold remotely, that it is strictly a matter of sea lines, sea level, and coastlines, and that it is not an enveloping crisis that will spare no one and leave no life, um, unchanged. So some say that it is a crisis of the natural world. It's not a human crisis, and that those two are distinct. That we today live somehow outside or beyond, or at the very least, we are defended against nature. We are not literally overwhelmed by it. Others say that our great wealth will shield us against the ravages of warming, and that even if we are burning fossil fuels, this is the price you pay for continued economic growth, and that growth and the technology it produces will inevitably find a solution, engineer out of environmental disaster, so to speak. But how can utter annihilation be an impossibility? So, in this book, the author writes about this disturbing fact that, and he gives us this figure, and I'll give you a few seconds to read what's written here. So, in fact, all but the one era that killed the dinosaurs involved climate change, and produced by greenhouse gas. The most notorious one was 250 million years ago. It began when carbon dioxide warmed the planet by 5 degrees Celsius, accelerated when that warming triggered the release of methane, another greenhouse gas, and ended with all but a sliver of life on Earth dead. Every species was dead except a few. And we are currently adding carbon to the atmosphere at a considerably faster rate. By most conservative estimates, also, it is 10 times faster. The rate is 100 times faster than at any point in human history before the beginning of industrialization. And this should be a wake up call for us. There is already right now fully a third more carbon in the atmosphere than at any point in the last 800,000 years, perhaps in as long as 15 million years, say climate experts. There were no humans then, and the oceans were more than 100 feet higher. Anyway, the human projections are bleaker. They say by 2050, we will have 200 million climate refugees. 200 million was the entire world population at the peak of the Roman Empire. If you can imagine every single person alive and living anywhere on the planet at that time, dispossessed of their home and turned outward to wander through hostile territories in search of a new one. So it's time that we learn to conceive of history not as a deliberate procession of years that are marching forward, says David Wallace Wells, on a timeline, but as an expanding balloon of population growth, humanity dilating across the planet almost to the point of full eclipse. So, how do we strike a balance? How do we leave a lighter carbon footprint of consuming less, giving back to the earth more in the process? Now, in the United States, you had, Rachel Carson's book, The Silent Spring, actually inaugurated the modern environmental movement in 1962. In India, the modern environmental movement was inaugurated by this grassroots struggle, pictures of which you see on the slide. It was called the Chipko movement, Andolan. Chipko literally means embrace, stick, cling to, okay? And people, the women in the region, poor disenfranchised women in this particular region near the Himalayas, engaged in a non-violent protest in this technique of protest, um, you know, to um, to protest against tree felling. So therefore, it's a grassroots struggle, and also it became something of deep symbolic and spiritual significance because trees are traditionally respected and worshipped in India. So what had happened at that time was that commercial forestry in the Himalayas had grave consequences for all of India. For it was in these mountains that our rivers were originating. And forest felling, if it continued unchecked, would not have just had an adverse effect or impact on the regional village economy from which these women were in a state called Uttarakhand today in North India, but it would have caused an accelerated floods, which would have imperiled all rural urban regions in the Indo-Gangetic plain. So anyway, this movement led to a major debate on Indian forest policy and so on, and it uh, helped fuel, more importantly, a wide debate on sustainable development, on whether India, could afford to imitate the resource-intensive, energy-intensive, and capital-intensive methods of industrialization that the West largely followed. So it was a peasant movement. Okay. Um, Anyway, now designers are not far behind in such initiatives to conserve the environment. I'll talk about quickly two design studios set up by NID graduates in the past few years. Now, this is an example. This is Pioli, and they are somewhere in the Himalayas, uh, in the same state where the Chipko movement had happened. And two of our textile design graduates have started, they work with women artisans in this region called Almora to develop a range of handmade woolen and cotton products. So Vasanti herself was in RMIT at one point of time to do her master's. What is their vision? They want to bring together design and indigenous crafts, skills in a way that you can produce world-class garments, but through a sustainable business and ecological model, and also make for sustainable livelihoods and economically empower these women in the region and bring dignity to their lives. So they follow a model of circularity, of using every valuable piece of fiber to the last scrap, and therefore it becomes one of its kind. So these are some snapshots of the people. Once upon a time, the local skills that existed here declined, or they already are in a state of decline because other cheaper products are available. A lot of villagers have migrated to towns and they sell their wares in tourist kind of towns. And so Purely decided to work with these women artisans, deploy eco-friendly methods like solar heating, rainwater harvesting, and increase dependence on manual skills over machine skills. So um, they basically provided a global platform to eco-friendly, high-quality, zero-waste products with a very low carbon footprint because of the kind of raw materials they used and the processes they used, which I shall come to. So these women, many of these women that you see here, and there are many, many more, are actually sometimes the sole earning members in their families. So it infuses a sense of pride and confidence in the humble craft that they produce. These are some of their products: naturally dyed, hand knit, woolen and cotton clothing and accessories. And so when we talk about their process, these are very simple hand processes that in uh, that the things that you see here: yarn spinning, organic dyeing, knitting, and so on, weaving. And the materials they use actually are indigenous fibers. They are sustainable materials. So Uttarakhand, this state, is blessed with a bounty of natural resources: fresh air, dense oak forests, crystal clear water streams, and so on. But of course, extreme weather conditions in the past few decades have affected this natural abundance caused by climate change, depletion of the water table because the population has increased, uh, and among other factors. So Pioli has a locally fueled model of sustainable development, and the kind of raw materials they use are uh, Tibetan wool, Hersil wool, nettle hemp, and dye stuffs, which are sourced from local farming communities. Then they spin them into soft, supple yarn using indigenous foot-operated spinning wheels, and so on. And then they craft these winter and summer apparel. They also use a non-violent form of silk, which is called ahimsa, which literally means non-violent, and eri silk, in which you obtain the silk without harming the silkworms. And they also use indigenous old world cotton, which is more resilient, less water consuming variety of cotton. They also import merino wool from New Zealand and combine these with the indigenous fibers to enhance their comfort and aesthetic appeal. So anyway, they use natural dyes or colorants which are derived from natural sources like they produce a living color, a living hue each time, uh, a color that matures and ages, pays a tribute to the sun, water, soil, and wind, and celebrates the source from which it has been cultivated. So, as we know, ethical dyeing basically means that you do not use synthetic chemicals at any stage of the dyeing process. You conserve the source of natural dyes, and you do not consume the roots, the heartwood, or the barks of perennial trees as dye materials. You avoid the use of plant materials, which is food to humans and animals, and you minimize the use of flowers, seeds, fruits gathered from the wild. So, a quick glimpse of their processes, of the skill development, and of the change that this has brought in the region. So these women have very little education. They mostly work at home. And in the past, they were either unemployed or they had seasonal, some kind of, livelihood. But most importantly, this has brought in an ecological consciousness in the region and to the conservation of natural resources and leaving a light carbon footprint. So harvested rainwater is used with solar energy for natural dyeing. And therefore, because of their green craft practices, they have uh, gained a large degree of recognition in a very short period of time. Now, like Pioli, there's another studio here in Ahmedabad, which is called Rhizome, which also demonstrates ecological consciousness along with craft as a vehicle for for economic uh, empowerment, and craft's importance as an ideological framework through which you can address sustainability in a more holistic manner. So, the ecological focus of sustainability efforts in the global north were not realistically transferable to the global south, is what the founders of Rhizome felt. And so they decided to have a different kind of model that would cater to the global south and consider its socio-economic priorities, where people are still struggling to provide basic human needs. So Rhizome therefore came up. Uh, you know, um, these are some of their products that you see. Uh, a quick glimpse, if you please. So they work with bamboo, okay? And how is it that bamboo is a renewable material? Because A, it regenerates quicker than other plants, is one of the fastest growing plant species. And because it is a grass, each plant sends up new poles every year. And this means that if you mindfully harvest a bamboo clump, it regenerates. You don't have to replant it. And it does not cause a complete loss of green cover, such as when you fell trees. Again, bamboo is a super carbon sink. Yeah, it incorporates 7 to 30% more carbon than other fast growing wood species. It controls soil erosion, which is again very, very important because its underground root and rhizome system, its root system is like ginger, it's rhizomatic. They create a mesh which holds the soil together and reduces soil runoff. So it is ideal for protecting mountain slopes from landslides and riverbanks from erosion. It rehabilitates degraded land, captures water, and its leaf fall creates mulch, which retains moisture and gives back, rehabilitates the soil. And again, the most important thing is that bamboo purifies water. It absorbs high amounts of nitrogen, which makes it a good solution to treat wastewater. But all of these factors have, of course, inspired an explosion of bamboo based design across India. But many of these design um, enterprises use industrially processed bamboo, where the bamboo pole is broken down into smaller components, pasted together with a standardized, sort of forms, boards, and panels. These industrial avatars use a lot of glue for lamination, which is often formaldehyde based and very unsustainable. And so the model that Rhizome has is quite sustainable. So bamboo, unlike other agricultural crops, it is inherently a pro-poor material. It does not depend on rain-fed farming. It shoots emerge at the first drop of rain, which makes it less vulnerable to erratic rainfall and climate change. So it's an ideal sort of something to harvest for the farmers. And the important thing is that wood has radial fibers, but bamboo has linear fibers. So it can be processed by low cost and using simple tools that marginalized communities can deploy. It is lightweight, so women are more easily able to process it using minimal equipment. And it has been widely handcrafted by indigenous communities, and bamboo working processes are part of traditional indigenous knowledge. Uh, so what Rhizome does, and this is absolutely my last slide, if you are losing patience, um, what Rhizome does is they ensure that their pieces are made from clean material. This means you use non-forest bamboo and you trace the origin of the bamboo. So the materials that they use are upcycled, repurposed, recycled, and renewable. And this material is ethically sourced. It is as local as possible. It is sourced at a fair rate from small vendors and not from big corporates. This ensures that the money that they pay out goes to sending kids to school, allows the women to go to doctors and seek proper health care, and does not line the purses of wealthy conglomerates. These pieces are handcrafted by traditional and contemporary craftspeople, so it keeps those skills alive. Livelihoods are looked after, and they don't use machines as far as possible unless it is to aid the human hand. So it's the handmade sort of feel, like arts and crafts uh, type uh, things. And they are a very good example of slow design. Uh, they don't design as per mainstream trends or seasons. They want to shake that giant machine which controls the design world. They do not follow trends very easily, but do it only when they think it is appropriate. And as I said, overall, they are, in their use of material, they are ecologically sustainable, they ethically produce through their team of craftspeople, and so on. Uh, and they share profits, which also makes it economically sustainable. So bamboo is integral to doing all of these because it is their vehicle to holistic sustainability. This is just an eco checklist for crafts products. I included it here. We sometimes use these for a certain course that we take at NID, which is called craft documentation. And these are some of the references I use today. So to come back to where I started from, if we do not want our future to be ecologically pillaged and colonized, we need to step up and do something about it. Who is this we? As designers, what are the ethical responsibilities we have is what we need to think. What are the individual choices we make that have a cascading effect on the environment? And we will either defeat warming or we will let it defeat us. It's as simple as that. And only single silver bullet policies of governments will not be enough to remedy the situation because there's too much corporate self interest that is vested there. And it's a very messy mix. So that's the food for thought uh, that I will leave you with today. Thank you for patiently listening to my one sided monologue.